Well, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for being here. In full transparency, I did collude with Eric on that. I did give him those rocks. But the story is true in that my upbringing in North Dakota has sort of influenced my interest in space exploration. And it has a lot to do with what I've observed and what I experienced growing up here. And one of the two of the most profound experiences, one was finding those rocks and the evidence of past life in the form of fossils, but also witnessing frogs come up from icy water one day when I was chopping ice for the cattle out north of the farmyard. And I thought, if life like a frog in North Dakota can survive in an ice pond, there's got to be life in other worlds. So that got me involved and interested in understanding what it takes to go explore other places like the Moon and Mars. And so most of my work has focused on understanding what happens to life forms when they leave Earth, and what kind of tools and technologies do you need to put in the covered wagon to the Moon, or the covered wagon to Mars, if you will. Much like the frontier lifestyle needed to think about before they ventured to the new worlds. And so my work focuses mostly on the big picture reason for why we're even interested in going to other worlds, in particular Mars, because it's the closest terrestrial object that has an atmosphere, and it has a very rich history of flowing water on its surface. Now, North Dakota had about a 3-month really awful drought. It's been a drought on Mars for much, much longer. We're talking millions and potentially billions of years. The last time large rain events formed gullies and river channels was in the Noachian, and there's some that go into the Hesperian, but what that means is we're talking 3 or so billion years ago. But there is a potential for life to exist in the subsurface, and some of the work we're doing is developing technologies to look there. We know that life, of course, is from here on Earth. It's been to the Moon through the Apollo missions, and there's a good deal of interest in 2 moons, one of Jupiter being Europa. It's an ice-covered moon that is, and these are sort of to scale, a little bit smaller than the Moon, but it's covered with 10 to 20, maybe 70 kilometer thick ice sheets, and underneath it is liquid water. And there's more liquid water on Europa than the Earth, and so it's a very interesting, potentially habitable environment for life forms. Probably microbial, but who knows? And Enceladus is another moon of Saturn that's a very interesting astrobiology target because it has geysers that are spewing water and other materials from the ice crust into the atmosphere, the very thin atmosphere of the Moon. And some of my friends at NASA are developing spacecraft that will fly to, or they're working on proposals that will develop spacecraft to fly to Enceladus, fly through the plume, and then collect samples and take a look at what's in it. And so these targets are of astrobiology and space biology relevance. We practice here and we deploy here, and we do that as we explore here as well, but it's all with robots right now. It may be another 20 to 30 years before we're even close to doing a human mission on Mars. This is what Mars may have looked like during that period when it was raining on Mars. There were very shallow seas, there were lots of lakes, and there were very clear river channels that were formed. But what has happened in the last few billion years, and it happened fairly rapidly, Mars freeze-dried and it rusted. And it is a giant polar desert today with enormous geologic features that any geologist would absolutely love to explore. And it also has tantalizing examples of rocks that could potentially contain evidence of past life. And what do I mean by evidence of past life? In North Dakota, we have a lot of evidence of past life. The state fossil is Teredo petrified wood. That's what this looks like. It's a little, or clams. We're digging in Cretaceous era sediments, and that fossilized. We also have evidence of past intelligent life. This is a arrowhead, that's a spearhead that my grandmother found just north of the farmyard on one of the trails. And this is an example of something that was not found in North Dakota, but most likely the kind of fossil evidence that we would be looking for if it existed on Mars. This is a stromatolite. Stromatolites are microbial mats that have turned to stone. And wherever you have rich, nutrient, water-rich sources, many times microbes will colonize those spots, and they will grow for many, many years, many tens of thousands of years, potentially. And if the conditions are right, they'll fossilize. And they have this very featuristic shape, and you can identify them very easily. Anybody ever seen this one? You know where this is from?
Pioneer 1?
Pioneer 10. Yep. This is evidence of life. But it's an artifact, and it's probably the furthest artifact from Earth right now. It's left the solar system. This is a plaque from the Pioneer 10 spacecraft. And this is a map for whatever civilization might find to trace back the spacecraft and what the beings were like in relation to the spacecraft. It's pretty amazing with some forethought. The scientists, this was a very last-minute addition where the engineers and scientists worked together, put together a plaque that could be sent out of the solar system in hopes of someday it being found. So all of this work that I'm talking about with regard to exploring space, if I go back in my experience, it boils down to the experience I had here in North Dakota and what I've learned from my ancestors. And it has everything to do with frontier life. And I think frontier life is a good model to consider when we think about exploring the moon for long durations or Mars for long durations. And I believe strongly that frontier life is why we, as North Dakotans, are suited, very well suited for space exploration. North Dakota's cold, it's flat, the ground freezes here. And you know, it's interesting, Californians, when they see that, they're like, we of course know what that's like, and we can take advantage of that, and it's a useful feature. Life also, if it's microbial, retreats to water-rich places and stays there, and it actually might be a place where we can look to find any evidence of microbes in the permafrost of Mars. Going back to the fact of frontier life, we're a resourceful people. We know how to live and work in cold environments, and we know how to live off the land. We are experts in food production, and this is something that the next generation of explorers that colonize off Earth, they're going to have to be able to do that. There's no plants growing right now on the moon or Mars, and the ag economy and all of the things that are related to food production and human consumption is absolutely linked to growing plants. And so that same theme is going to be required, I believe, in future colonies. The other thing that it's important to note is we're comfortable when living in small towns and in isolated settings. And we know how to deal with bad weather, and sometimes we have to stay put. And we have exploration in our heritage. Many of our ancestors made one-way trips from the old world to the new world. And in some cases, they were well prepared. In other cases, they took a leap of faith that where they were going was going to be enough to be able to support them. And these pictures are good examples of just that. It was common tradition for families to wear their Sunday best and pose in front of their sod homes with all of their possessions. And the point of this is that these resourceful people were able to use the resources that were local with a small amount of supplies that were shipped in or produced in regional areas to build things that were needed. And this same approach of in situ resource utilization, using materials from the moon or using materials from Mars, will be needed for future explorers. And some of the people that came to North Dakota were also part of the ancestors that gave rise to the explorers that explored some of the coldest and most extreme places here on Earth, namely Antarctica. And it was not that long ago that people first set foot at the South Pole. The Amundsen expedition and the Scott expedition did it within a couple of weeks of each other. And they used technologies along this trip that I would argue are something that we need to very closely take a look at and use also for lunar and Mars exploration. And one of those examples is the Scott tent. This is a very straightforward, portable shelter. This is one that I put up a couple of kilometers away from the South Pole. And inside it, it's really warm if you have the right kind of gear, and it's quite comfortable. And this technology was borrowed from other civilizations that came long before us, namely in this case, another example of a portable shelter. These kinds of technologies are useful on Earth, they're useful in Antarctica, and adapted versions of these same kinds of technologies will be useful in future lunar and Mars exploration. Now those were portable shelters. The type of semi-permanent or permanent shelters that first were used here featuring in situ resource utilization were the earth lodges that Native Americans put together. What's interesting about this is that this is modeled with scenarios for exploration of the moon and Mars. In fact, this is a European Space Agency image. You can see ESA right here. And the point is that we take rocks and dirt from the moon and we cover a small structure, and the material that we cover the structure with acts as a shield, and it can protect the astronauts that would live inside from the harmful environments of the exterior, whether it's extreme heat or extreme cold. The Earth Lodge, or in this case the Regolith Lodge, serves the same purpose. But moving into a more highly technologically advanced approach are buildings that will be constructed on site by robots. 3D printed regolith lodges are being explored now as an option for future colonization. It's fascinating to imagine, well, if you think about an explorer, in Antarctica 100 years ago, if you would have told them that you could have a device when you're at the South Pole and you could call the King of Norway and say you've made it, he'd think you're crazy. The same thing probably is true for many of us, including myself, if I think we're going to 3D print buildings. Well, we're actually moving in that direction. In fact, some of these rammed earth technologies and 3D printing buildings are being, the technology is being developed for actual use in cities and towns here on Earth. Along those same lines, technology is a very important theme because humans alone can't do this, whether it's animal power or human power or the power of technology. Heavy machinery and things like this are going to be needed. I took this picture at the South Pole when the Traverse had arrived at the South Pole. What the Traverse is a 1,000 or so mile trip from McMurdo Base to South Pole, and these large tractors pull sleds full of supplies. It's kind of like a spacecraft leaving Earth and resupplying the space station, except it takes a lot longer. And it was kind of a miraculous day when we were down there, because when the Traverse arrived, you could see it way off in the horizon, and people were getting really excited because this is the first thing that came overland in months. And I was really surprised when I walked up to one of the tractors. Where's that made? It's made in Fargo. Think about that. The technology, heavy industrial technology is being developed here in North Dakota, and it's being applied and utilized in an exploration setting in Antarctica. And I would argue that we should adapt one of these things so that it can be used on the moon, and that we can show how heavy equipment from North Dakota can be used in useful purposes on the moon. The next thing that's important about North Dakota and how we relate is the Bakken. Energy production and energy use is going to be something that will be absolutely critical for any colony off Earth. And in North Dakota, we have become expert in energy production, but we've also become expert in energy release, as you can see in that square. If we zoom up on it, flares, this is an image in 2014, I think. This is sort of the maximum flaring period. These flares can be seen from space, and the source of them is methane gas, and the methane gas is being burned because it is not being collected And what's interesting about this from a planetary science perspective is that some of this methane may have been produced biologically. And we're talking about a deep subsurface biosphere that existed long in the past that is now being tapped for energy production. And it's interesting, some of the oldest rock-bearing strata ever characterized have shown that some oil can be found in sediments that are 1 billion or so years old. Not a lot of them are going to be very productive from that age, but it's an interesting point in that if conditions were favorable on Mars with regard to shallow seas and enough light energy, it's possible that biology could have existed and we might be able to see signatures of methane on Mars. And in fact, we do. Mars burps every now and then, and we see large increases in the amount of methane in the atmosphere of Mars. We don't know if that is biological or just geologic in nature, but the fact is that it's there. And in this feature, we know that some of that is produced biologically. And if we zoom in a little bit closer, this is a very high-resolution image from space looking at the Bakken Formation. This is probably what terraforming might look like if it were to be happening on another planet, where massive releases of carbon dioxide were being put into the atmosphere for the purposes of warming the planet. And I would like to draw your attention. You can kind of see just some features here. This is the Van Hook arm, and this is Lake Sakakawea, and then part of the river. And then this is where the little Missouri, I think, where is it? Yeah, flows in here. And I believe this little dark spot is, or it might be this one, is the national park. The North Unit, right in there. But in addition to just the oil and the methane that's being produced from the Bakken Formation, we get a lot of salt water, huge amounts of it. And that salt water is radioactive, it is energy rich in that sense, and it is also full of all kinds of nutrients. It's unknown if microbes are living in there, although chances are the pressures and the temperatures are so high that it's a much more difficult environment for microbes to live in. However, recent studies of some of this flowback water, such as the one that's seen in this container, by using culture-dependent methods, that is, if you take some of the material here and grow it in conditions that are like the subsurface, you can actually find about 40 or so different strains of bacteria and microbes that are living in it. Now, it's not known if that's coming from at the actual Bakken Formation or somewhere in between, but some of the tests have shown that, in fact, they seem to select for very hot, high-pressure environments. It's very interesting. And that deep biosphere is something that NASA is very interested in, because the deep biosphere is one possible area that life could exist on Mars. It probably doesn't exist on the surface because the radiation is so high that it naturally sterilizes the surface. The UV lamps that are used in any biological safety hood produces the same kind of flux of UV as what is received on the surface of Mars. So chances are the surface is sterile. But if you go under rocks or if you go into the subsurface where there might be ice or salt, you might find life. And the other interesting thing about the Bakken Formation is that it happened in the late Devonian, which was an extended period of extinction. And if you zoom in on this very, very detailed and highly organized map of the geologic strata of North Dakota, what you'll notice is that the Devonian butts up against the Carboniferous and Mississippian, and this is an extinction boundary. And what you'll see is that there's a color difference between an uncharacterized member and the Madison. In fact, the Bakken actually overlays that feature. And so the reason why I'm bringing this up is because we're drilling thousands and thousands of holes deep into the subsurface, and we might actually learn something about the ancient environment, whether it was affected by extinction or not, and if there's any potential life that could still exist there. What we do know is that massive amounts of biocides are pumped into the wells to reduce the bioload, to eliminate some of the filming, the biofilms that form. But there's some studies that are out there that are suggesting that that may not be needed anymore because the conditions are inhospitable to life. But I would like to work with some geologists and microbiologists from here to see if we can figure out a way to get some samples and do some nanopore DNA sequencing of the samples, not worrying about culture-dependent techniques, and just see what kind of DNA, if any, exists in those samples. And this gives you an idea of how hot it is in the Bakken. This is from a recent paper. This is the borehole depth temperatures. We're talking about close to 300 degrees Fahrenheit. And you're probably thinking, well, that's way too hot for life. And that may be true, but some of these places, such as black smokers and the hot hydrothermal vents under enormous pressure in the oceans are conducive to life. And I don't know that we've developed techniques yet to determine if life can survive in those environments, because I don't know if anybody's ever looked. This is a unique opportunity for scientists and engineers to work together to explore that. And it's also our use of and production of carbon dioxide in all of these different places across the Earth is causing the atmosphere to change. And it's one of the things that I've also observed on my trips across the world. And probably the most prominent example of that is the North Pole. And I've done field work here in Svalbard. I've done some field work in Iceland. A lot of my friends have done work in Devon Island in this region. And the messages that I hear from all of them, including the people who live there locally, is that the conditions are changing, and it's changing rapidly. And a good example it can be seen from planes, or just if you get on the ground in Svalbard. I took this photo as we were coming into Svalbard, and after exploring a little bit, there's a fjord near the town of Longyearbyen, which is where we were staying. Excuse me. And this fjord is called Ice Fjord. But that year, in 2008, was the first time that it was ever ice-free. And it shocked the locals. And I remember hearing them tell me about it because it was something that no one had ever expected. It was completely unexpected. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it's remained ice-free, but I'd have to check. So this melting, while it may be caused in part by humans or through natural variations in Earth's climate, without a doubt, it's happening. And if we go to the places where the melting is happening most rapidly, such as in Iceland, you can walk up to the edge of these gigantic ice features. And this thing is not going to be there in 100 years. I was there last fall. I was presenting at a Mars Polar Science Conference, and we visited this polar ice cap. And it was a couple kilometer walk to get there, but when we got there, we discovered that there was some tourists that were hanging out in a bus, and you can see a whole bunch of snowmobiles here. And here's a bunch of people right here. These features are gigantic, and this is a small one. But what you notice when you walk up to them is that there's water pouring off them like crazy. And if you crawl inside them, what you find is there are little channels where water flows through them. And sometimes they're chock full of water, and sometimes they're chock full of sediment, because rivers carry dirt. They move dirt, like the Missouri River. It's a giant earth-moving machine. The same thing is true of glaciers and the water that melts out of them. And when that happens, you get these sinuous river beds that are inverted. They deposit the sand and rocks and sediment sort of in a channel above the ground because they're ice-walled rivers. And when the ice melts back, it exposes these very unusual snake-like features. This is an esker. You can walk right up to them, and they're basically giant piles of gravel. In some cases, they're large stones and pebbles and so on. But the connection here is that eastern North Dakota is a lot like Iceland, or at least the way it was 9 or so, 10,000 years ago. This is a digital elevation model of of Lake Agassiz, and you can see where these two large lobes of glaciers kind of split right here near Cayuga, North Dakota, and up here near Fordville in Dallin. We visited those two spots on a NASA spaceward-bound expedition in 2009 and 10, and we walked right up to one of those eskers. That is an esker. That's the same thing as that. These things formed in ice-walled rivers. And so what we did is we dug into it and we took samples out of it to see what kind of microbes might be in it. We expected microbes and we found them, but what we learned is that the microbes sort of colonize in different stratified ways. And it offers a fingerprint of that particular kind of geologic feature. And the point is that if we learn how to explore these things here in North Dakota, it's going to inform us and train us on how to explore them when we get to Mars. And if you don't believe me, there are glaciers on Mars. In some cases, there are rock glaciers. And there are features that appear to be like eskers or inverted river channels. So we know that these similar types of features exist there. And so they're very interesting geologically, but astrobiologically, they're also very interesting because they were formed by flowing water. And wherever we find water on Earth, we find life. But before we travel to Mars, we must learn what the trip will be like and understand how we will change during the journey. That is not a TIE fighter. That is the space station. It moves its solar panels in a way to maximize the energy from the sun. And the environment of the space station, I would argue, is an extreme environment. That doesn't look much like a lab here on Earth, but that's the state-of-the-art, world-class laboratory in the space station. And you can kind of see a few things for example. This is a laptop. Here's a ergometer. This is a bike pedal. And these things are racks. This is where experiments and tools and devices are deployed and stowed when they're not being used. And I was involved recently last summer. I helped to develop and build a seed germination study. And we worked with the Norwegians. They are an important partner in the European Space Agency. And part of their equipment here, this is called the European Modular Cultivation System, where we put together a very small package of seeds. And this device is designed to, on command, release a small amount of water and nutrients to germinate the seeds. And you can see that they're very tiny. They're about the size of the head of a pin. Well, why in the world would we want to worry about that? Why worry about germinating seeds in the space station? Well, if we're traveling long distances to Mars or beyond, and if we have an intent of eating any plants or working with plants, we're going to be taking the seeds with us. Probably like what the frontier folk did when they left the old world. And if we do that, we're going to want to make sure that those plants actually germinate when we get to the place we're trying to get to. And this study looked at that, but it also looked at the ability of the seeds to tolerate artificial gravity. And what we're also trying to understand is, will seeds and roots and shoots and blooms behave the same as we expect here on Mars? On Earth as they do on Mars? It's unknown. What we've learned is that gravity alone does not influence roots. We've learned that small amounts of red light in the absence of gravity can make roots grow in the direction towards the light. That's really interesting. That wasn't something that was known before the studies were done a few years ago. And so that has implications for very long duration spaceflight, that if we want roots to grow in a certain direction, just shine a little bit of red light on it. We didn't know that before, but that's a very interesting finding. So the hope is that we can do something like this guy in The Martian did. Eventually, we're going to want to be producing food wherever it is we're going, whether it's on the moon or Mars. And this very inspirational movie, much of which was correct, I really liked it, is pretty spot on in terms of the need for nutrients and the importance of recycling our waste, whether it be solid, liquid, or other. That's going to be a very important component. Almost all the water that we're going to be using is going to be recycled in some way, and it's happening already on the space station. And the same thing is true for future missions with our solid waste. And at the University of Arizona, they're already working on a plant module that's inflatable, and they're growing plants in it. This is something that's developing technologies that can be deployed on the moon. And in the space station, we've grown plants and flowering plants as well. But we've also run into some problems. Some of the plants didn't behave as we expected. And I saw the same thing happen at the South Pole when I was growing plants there too. When the hardware has a problem, that is, if something goes wrong, or there's a software problem, or a pump fails, or something goes wrong, it means that the plants may be in danger. Because if there's too much water, the plants can mold. And farmers and ranchers around here know that. If the conditions are right in the wheat or the oats, if there's too much rain, you get rust. Same thing can happen here. And what we found is that some of these zinnia plants actually started molding in some examples. But with some careful gardening techniques, if you will, they were able to resurrect some of these plants and get them to bloom on the space station. But that's not the only plant that's been grown up there. A variety of lettuce and other mizuna, and of course wheat. In fact, wheat, it's hard to believe, but just a couple of weeks ago was the first time that the genome was fully sequenced. I thought, wow, I would have expected that to happen a long time ago, but we still are learning about wheat. And the astronauts that I've talked to and worked with, they say that they really enjoy working with plants. And to be around them is something that they treasure. It reminds them of home, and it's how they cope with being away. But it's also important to note that some of the experiences I had at South Pole were that the presence of plants reminded the people of what they were missing, and it kind of made them depressed. So it's important to consider that when we're dealing with crew selection or training. And being able to cope with the time away and what you'll be missing is also an important component. But this environment is a very strange one. It's a microgravity environment. It's an altered gravity environment. And it does very strange things to your body. This is an older picture. But what you can see is that the moment that the aircraft, I was in a parabolic flight, the moment that we went into the dive, these veins in my head just started popping out. And that happens to everybody when you go into a microgravity environment. When gravity stops acting on you, it's like a switch. Your muscles continue to work in the way that they were before, and instead of them squeezing blood back up to your head against the force of gravity, there's no gravity, and it just pushes a lot of those fluids towards your head. You get this thing called moon phase. And it's interesting. What we're learning is that not only is your immune system altered, your cardiac muscle changes, you urinate your skeleton out at a rate of 1% to 2% a month. So you're losing bone mass all the time. Your brain changes shape, and your eyeball does too, and you have vision problems in some cases that do not correct for extended periods of time. Now, these things may not be showstoppers per se, but they're important considerations in preparing for long-duration exploration. And so to manage the issues that are presented by these biological changes is something that we need to very seriously consider. But microgravity is not the only thing that astronauts or technologies are exposed to. It's hypergravity as well. And one of the things that I worked on with University of North Dakota was the development of an experiment that tested a flight suit in our 20G centrifuge at NASA Ames. The flight suit is something that a person wears when you're on launch or re-entry. It's not what you would wear on the moon or on Mars. It's essentially a balloon that you tighten up and inflate on launch so that you are able to survive if something happens for a few minutes, if the spacecraft becomes depressurized. And so what we did was we put a dummy into the spacesuit, inflated it, and then spun it at an acceleration rate that simulates a launch. And what we showed is that this spacesuit was able to maintain its pressure and function normally. And the thing that I draw your attention to is that this spacesuit was built by students at the University of North Dakota with the help of the staff in the Space Studies Department. And astronaut Rick Linehan tried it on the day we were there. He said it fit better than anything he's ever worn in space. And so I thought, yeah, UND. So before humans live on Mars, we must practice what it's like to live on Mars right here on Earth. It's kind of like getting ready for the real thing. It's like practicing your concerto before the big concert, or practicing the saxophone before you give up a solo. And we are working on this at the University of North Dakota. This is an artist's diagram of what is referred to as the inflatable lunar and Mars habitat that consists of a plant module, an EVA room, and we all are familiar with EVA rooms here in North Dakota. We call them mud rooms here, right? It's the place where you take your clothes from the outside off and you leave those muddy boots or those boots full of snow in that little exterior room that may not be heated. That's the same kind of approach that we're using here for our modules. And we also have an exercise module and a geology module. And I'm working with astronaut Yvonne Kegel on the development of this particular module and providing advice as to what the crew should be using when they're living in the hab. And just recently, UND finished a couple more of those modules. The whole thing is not completely constructed yet, but they've been testing it, and you can take a look at some of the recent results in this Spacesuit Lab blogspot website. This is kind of the frontier picture of the family here with all their possessions. They have a small generator here and a UAV, I guess. Well, they also have a small car, but they don't have a garage for it yet. That's coming. But on the car are two suits that hang out the back. And the reason why those suits are hanging out the back is because once you're in the car, you can crawl into the suit from inside the pressurized module and then detach and then leave the module and go walk around. It's a really clever technique and approach so that you're not always dragging in that dirt from the moon or Mars into your habitat. I mean, the analogy is whenever I go to the Missouri River, if I wear my shoes, invariably they fill up with sand. And I'm dragging that sand back into my car, and then it's in the house, and it's in my socks, and what a mess. Same thing is true on the moon and Mars. And the astronauts that I talked to that have been to the moon have expressed that dust is a real problem. And so a lot of these components have been demonstrated. The habitat and the rover and the two suits, and they're able to interface and work together. Just a few pictures to give you an idea of what it looks like inside. This is what it looks like when people jump into the suits, and then they can release them and then go outside and do stuff. Now, you might think, well, is Grand Forks really like Mars? Well, yes and no. The temperatures are pretty close. On a cold day in Grand Forks, it's 40 below. I mean, that happens here too. But that's a common temperature on Mars. And if you can live and work outside in those kind of temperatures, it's a good first step towards being able to do that in the real thing. But it's important to note that the temperatures on average are much colder than that on Mars. And in some cases, the temperatures can actually get a little bit above thawing or a little bit above freezing, but that's rare. Inside the habitat is a roomy place. Several different crews have worked in there. This is the plant module. They're developing a few small plant studies. And again, this is sort of in a very early stages of its development. It's being demonstrated to show that it can be used and how it can be useful to whether it's the human research program or the space biology program. Good example of a few plant studies that they worked on. You can see some of the plants grew much better than others. Some of them didn't grow at all. And that's an important learning curve to go through. Understanding what seeds we should take, what technologies we should use, and how to optimize the growing of the plants that we'll be depending on, is something that we have to practice here on Earth well before we ever leave to go explore these cold, dry places. And on that same theme, we have to understand how to explore deserts if we're going to do this. And so some of the work that I've done is involving exploring some of the driest places on Earth and some of the biggest sand piles that there are. This is the Rub al Khali Desert in Saudi Arabia, on the Saudi Arabia Peninsula, or below that, in that region. It's actually in the UAE, but it's all similar types of sands. And this is a feature called a sabkha, and in these sabkhas, they're very salt-rich environments, and so you have these dunes that are migrating over the top of these salt-rich environments, and it's in these places where small amounts of liquid water still exist. And before I go there, this is just for scale, kind of give you an idea how big some of these things are. It's really quite stunning how huge these dunes are. These people look, you know, like they're really close, but that's a big distance between here and there. And this thing is, it's not vertical, it's very triangular in shape. So while we're there, we're learning how to explore deserts, but also find evidence of past and present life. And in that sabkha was one giant hypersaline environment. And they were covered by thick salt crusts. And we crawled around in there, and that salt water was so salty, it would sting your skin. And it was much saltier than ocean water. And I would argue that this is probably as salty as Bakken water. But what we found in it is life, lots of life, microbes galore. Obviously, this isn't at high temperatures. We're only talking about, you know, like 120 degrees on the surface, maybe a little bit more. And there's no pressure. But we find very stratified ecologies in this hypersaline environment. They've diversified. They've formed a network. And we published a paper about that in PLOS One in 2016. But life doesn't just live in, you know, ice or salt. It also lives underneath rocks too. And in some cases, rocks that are perfectly situated to allow small amounts of light to pass through them and allow for condensation of water underneath them will promote the growth of photosynthetic microbes. When we go to Mars, we're not looking for little green men. We're looking for little green microbes. And this is probably a good example of what life on Mars would look like if it exists there. And along those same lines, we need to do work in the polar regions of Earth to prepare us for Mars as well. And we have tested the NDX-1 planetary prototype spacesuit, the thing you would actually wear when you're working outside in a Mars or lunar environment, to do operations, to collect samples and to deploy instrumentation and so on. And this suit was also developed by University of North Dakota. Is that suit still here? So if you have a chance, a suit just like this, or maybe it's the actual one, is here in the Heritage Center. While we were there, we deployed technologies to measure temperatures in the subsurface and measure the radiation environment in the nearby subsurface as well. And what we're learning is that radioactivity, while it can be harmful to humans, might actually be beneficial to microbes and serve as an energy source in the subsurface environment on Mars. And what's interesting is that there are places where there are radioactive rich elements and ice in the northern regions of Mars, kind of like where North Dakota is on the Earth. And I would argue that that might be a good place to dig and look for evidence of present or past life. And just a couple of pictures. This was from an expedition in Marambio that I was on. This was an area where early settlers or people attempting to explore and settle Antarctica. And at that point, they weren't able to settle. But what's interesting is the Argentines have settled several bases on the peninsula, and they're establishing their presence. And they have schools, people are having babies, there's families living there. In fact, I'm working with one of the scientists from their Antarctic effort in the development of a greenhouse for the people of Esperanza. This is Cockburn Island. This picture was taken, I think, in 1904. It might have been a little later than that. But I discovered I actually was in about the same place. The time that the picture was taken was a little bit different. This probably was summer, whereas that was more of a winter. But the point is that the conditions are changing, and we're seeing large amounts of ice sheets starting to open up around Antarctica as well. And because I love the capital, these things are huge. There's no reference for scale on some of these structures. And the same thing is going to happen for explorers when we go on long duration lunar or Mars exploration. And we have to be prepared for these very unusual environments. And so an important point of this also is that living in a remote Mars habitat simulator is really challenging. And I've done it a few times in Utah at the Mars Desert Research Station. And I work with people that also work with people that live in the Human Exploration Research Analog in Johnson Space Center. So the difference is that this facility is inside a building in Houston, and this is outside at Utah. And the one we're building in Grand Forks is outside where it's cold. So each of these have their unique features. This is more higher fidelity technologies. This is more desert-like experience. And the experience people that will live and work in the hab here in North Dakota is that they'll get the cold. They'll see what it's like to have to work outside. We know what it's like, but some of these folks who are interested in space exploration that work, in these fields, some of them have never actually spent any time in a parka. We also took that spacesuit to some of the oldest fossils on planet Earth. We went to the outback of Western Australia in the Pilbara. These red rocks are billions of years old. We believe that they may be the oldest fossils on planet Earth, and they are relics of microbial mats that formed billions of years ago, almost as soon as life could have existed on Earth. They seem to have formed, and what they are is stromatolites. They're just simply microbial mats that form like mushrooms. It's really weird. So if the shallow landform seas interactions are just right, you can get these microbial mats that start to build up layer after layer after layer after layer after layer after layer. And if they're there long enough, or if they get buried, they can be fossilized. And that's what we find in the Pilbara. Well, why in the world are we taking the spacesuit there? The reason why we're doing that is because if we're looking for life on Mars, it's probably going to be fossil. And we want to know if an astronaut can see a stromatolite when they walk up to it, or one that's been churned around and changed over billions of years, because the life that existed on Mars, if it did, was probably billions of years ago in those ancient warmer environments. And so we wandered around taking a look, and what we found is that the people that are in the suit miss a lot of stuff. And so we need to train the people who are wearing the spacesuits on what to look for and how to work in the suit. Some astronauts who have worked in spacesuits on orbit have actually injured themselves as a result of sort of not the ideal human factors. Needing to strain against an arm or component or a part of the leg. It's easy to want to push harder, but you may not have the mobility, and people are getting injured. The other thing about Mars is that dust is going to be a problem. We know all about dust here in North Dakota. It's something that's pervasive, it's always there, and you're always dealing with it. And the same thing is true in Mars, and the conditions change rapidly. What we've seen is that over the course of a month, the entire planet can be completely enveloped in a dust storm. And that dust is highly chemically reactive. We've learned from some of the recent Phoenix missions, and since then Curiosity, that oxychlorine species dominate the dirt and are highly chemically reactive. But what's interesting is that if you pour liquid water on it, it releases oxygen. So this is an important point in that we might find use in hydrating Mars dirt to produce oxygen, but we have to be very careful because those perchlorates that are in the dirt are also known to be toxic to humans in parts per billion. Perchlorate is not allowed in drinking water in parts per billions, but we find perchlorates in parts per million, an order of magnitude more on Mars. And so what we've done is we've worked with samples that have come from the moon, and we've learned that dust from the moon is moderately toxic. So I would predict the same thing is probably true for Mars. But the chemical composition is very different. But the point is that you can take samples if you actually pick it up and work with it, or you send a robot to go get it. And we brought back hundreds of pounds of samples during the Apollo mission, and this is from an Apollo 14 sample. We took small amounts of it and put it into the lungs of rats, and then euthanized the animals and took the cells out of the lungs to see how aggravated the cells were. And what we learned is that the cells were actually had a large amount of inflammatory process going on. Now, it's not as toxic as silica dust, which is known to be highly toxic, but the point is that it's something we can't ignore. So in our covered wagon to the moon, we're going to have to put in kits to deal with dust. And in addition to that, we're going to have to understand what that dirt does to our parkas and our boots and our spacesuits. And that's exactly what UND is doing with Kennedy Space Center. And we're working with the spacesuit and trying some very simple maneuvers and techniques to see what a large amount of Mars and lunar simulants do to the suit itself. In this case, they were working with lunar simulants, and you can see there's a person in the next photo. They're wearing respirators because they don't want to be breathing this stuff in. What lunar simulants are like is basically like ground up basalt. So it's like rocks from Hawaii, from rocks that are coming out of that lava. If you grind it up and pulverize it into a dust, and I may have a sample here I can show you if you're interested. It's very abrasive stuff. Here's a really iconic photo. Some of you might have seen this. Remember where this was at? This was in the National Geographic. I don't know if any of you saw it. But this National Geographic photo featured the UND spacesuit, the one that's here at the Heritage Center. So all of these things together, I think the most interesting place that we can really challenge ourselves is Antarctica. If we can do it in North Dakota, then we can test that technologies in even harsher environments. It's obviously much colder. We have a base there, this Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, but it's it's like a beautiful, warm environment. What I would propose is that we transfer the UND habitat once it's complete and ready to go, and move it to Antarctica and try it there and see how it works. It may not have to be at the South Pole, but in permanently frozen regions, maybe the dry valleys, a very interesting prospect. And just to give you perspective, it's a stark landscape. And the same thing is true of the very flat places of Mars, where we expect the safest landing ellipses to exist. But in the South Pole station is the greenhouse, and I worked there for a few months in food production. And this gets back to the egg economy that's so necessary for future colonists. And it's this plant mass and this plant material that not only nourishes us, but it also gives us the strength in terms of our inspiration and motivation and the connectedness to things from Earth. And it was interesting when I was working in there, people would frequently come in there because it was the only place in Antarctica that you could get a gulp of humid air, and you could smell, plants and wet material. It's weird. You take that for granted when you've been away for a long time. We're used to that here in North Dakota with winters, but people elsewhere are not. And it was interesting to see how that affected them. And so, growing plants was something that was very rewarding. And it's something that I think stems from my experience in growing plants here in North Dakota. And a few years ago, a colleague of mine put together a time lapse, and I'll just quickly show you this. This is 23 days of growth in the South Pole greenhouse. And I would predict this eventually is what the plant growth chamber will probably be doing for UND once it's complete. So each frame is a day. So it's very, very stunning. When you optimize the technologies, you can get a lot of production very quickly. But that brings me to my last topic, culture. Some of you recognize some of these things probably. What are we going to take with us that's really important in terms of culture when we go to these new worlds? You know, I was in Elmont for the Lutefisk dinner last weekend. Well, yeah, the first weekend in November, that Saturday. And so I would say, you know, think about sending lutefisk, although that's probably not going to happen. Pierogies, or maybe Fleischkekle, I don't know. I'm sort of joking about these things because to do that is going to be a stretch. Although you never know, the things that show up on spacecraft will surprise you, whether it's a flag or a toy or something important. These cultural components are something that astronauts take with them wherever they go at some level. And I would suggest that we consider sending seeds from North Dakota, perhaps the most important seeds that our egg economy depends on, or indigenous heirloom varietals, so that those could be used as a gene stock and a gene bank for future colonies. And so, just to close, there's some fantastic artwork that NASA is putting together right now that I'd just like to share with you, and I'll let you read it. I would have never imagined to see this one. I think that's great. So in closing, just want to let you know that NASA is thinking about people in all places of the planet, and in my perspective, what we've experienced here in North Dakota will contribute significantly and substantially in our future efforts to explore the Moon and Mars. Thanks.